So I'm thrilled to be joined this afternoon by two wonderful individuals. We are going to have a discussion that's going to be moderated by one of our Conduit impact champions, Lily Lewis. Lily is the founder of the Progressi Initiative, a grant-giving organisation that partners with grassroots organisations working in abstinence-based addiction treatment or youth violence. I'm going to hand over to Lily to introduce Derek, and I hope that you enjoyed the conversation this evening. Thanks, Lily.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Okay, Derek, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So we're going to talk about your book this evening, kind of using it as kind of a touching base for discussions within the charity and the philanthropic sector as a whole. So among calling for reparations and a revisal of the charity and philanthropic practice, giving back weaves in Derek's life experiences that has shaped his commitment to justice. These include his experiences of racism and the white gaze from childhood to adulthood, his career in music journalism, where he was able to observe the ways that Black artists influence societal shifts. And within the charity and philanthropic sector, Derek's worked in many different roles, starting as a youth worker, then as a grant manager, and eventually becoming a key power figure in various significant charitable foundations across the UK. Although the charity and philanthropic sector prides itself for centering care and transformation, there's also an omnipresent centering of the white experience, continuing to perpetrate cycles of harm that manifest in the structures of capitalism and white supremacy. Giving Back illustrates what it means to be an outsider working within these systems in different ways. Derek centers storytelling, wanting to know what has shaped activists working to change these systems. And within it, he redefines and reimagines the concept of charity and philanthropy, giving many of us hope. So Derek, you finished writing this book in lockdown, and it got published around August this year. What has the reception been in and outside of the charity sector?
Thanks, Lily, and thanks for the kind words. I mean, first thing, so the reception's been good, and the reception from the charity sector, philanthropic sector, and social enterprise, our world, has been really, really good and positive. So that's nice. One of the things that really dawns to me is that outside of our world, it's almost like we don't exist. It's like there isn't a kind of narrative around how social change happens within the third sector or the charitable sector. And what I mean by that is when I speak to anyone outside of our world, it's generally, okay, yeah, that's a great thing that you're writing about, but can you write about safeguarding issues? Or can you write about something that's going to be negative? Can you hammer someone that is really wealthy? And so one of the things I wanted to do with the book was start to change the narrative about not just the charity sector, but social enterprise, civil society, whatever you want to call it. But the world that we occupy, the thing that's really special about it is that you do have amazing people with lived experiences of the issues who are affecting change, but you also get people that are really good at doing complexity. And some of the solutions that you read in the newspapers around how to alleviate some of the issues in education, focus very specifically about education and don't really take into context wider issues. So if you look at, I don't know, the Contextual Safeguarding Network or Project 507 or Healing Justice London, 1,000,001 different great organizations, they are doing complexity. But how you message that to power brokers, policymakers, and others is seems to me a real challenge. And when I break down the book is about reimagining philanthropy, you know, through a reparative lens. But it's in 3 sections, and I look at the sections as the head, the heart, and the hands. And the head bit is the critique of philanthropy, and that's only 25% of the book, right? So 25% is the heart, is like why we give. So it's stories that people have said to me, yourself included, Lily, Mara Larisai, and various other amazing people about why they give. And then 50% of the book is stories of people that are affecting change. And it's about solutions. It's about if, for example, the local authorities, we don't have local authorities in 30 or 40 years' time because they've gone bankrupt for whatever. actually there are people in the UK that are reimagining what it means to have a regenerative local society or a place-based way of doing things. And these are valid, viable alternatives to the status quo. These are also things that philanthropists could be funding or should be funding and incentivizing some of that. So it always occurs to me that sort of 75% of the book is not critique. It is actually more around solutions. But what people keep coming back to from the outside is, who are we going to hammer in this particular sector?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there's a lot of activists based in the book, but they're still getting missed by the funding sector. Why is that?
Well, if I'm being honest, it's like I would look at the funding sector and who governs it as having 19th century thinking, right? So when you start to think about 19th century thinking, you start to look at things through very much a lens of, we do not trust communities of color, we do not trust communities that have been minoritized in society. The lens is very much colonial. It's very much based on, we know best. It's very much based on still ownership and conquering, which is a very Eurocentric European thing, is we want to own, we want to conquer, this obsession with possession. So when you have things that fundamentally challenge that, then I think it's really hard for people to get their heads around it. I think there is a genuine also lack of ambition. So again, when I speak of people, and there's people that's in this room who are amazing working in the field of philanthropy, who are highly ambitious. And they're ambitious because they're really looking at social transformation as the lens through which philanthropy could really facilitate change. But they're having to deal with decision makers who are only looking for minor improvements. They're only looking for things to be marginally better. So you often get lots of people that are change makers within the field that do not get they're bringing like 50% of themselves to work, because ultimately they're trying to look at things like land reparations. They're trying to look at things like, what does reparations look like in terms of endowments? They're trying to do ambitious things, but they're dealing with decision makers that, as I said, I think is very much in the 19th century in terms of mentality.
So thinking about possible change that's happened or is happening around that since the murder of George Floyd, do you feel like there has been progression with the sector, especially in white spaces?
I'm going to come on to some positive stuff soon. No, so I think there's been a lot of performative actions and a lot of statements. And I think what I've seen, which, and I understand why people have done this, where we've got lots of real short-term sort of funding programs, but all it really does is put us back into competition with each other again. And that's the thing that's the narrative that we're trying to get out of. We want to centralize this, not minoritize it. So everything that I see minoritizes this as an issue instead of tries to centralize it. And that's what really bothers me. And again, I'm not going to be sitting here, and it's really difficult because you get called into consultations and you're sitting there and you're like, I don't want a 3-year funding program. I want you to centralize this piece of work. But then the other thing is, you don't want to be a blocker to stop people from getting the money out. So I always say to people, you can have a dual strategy where you say, over the next, not 3 years, but 10 years, we're getting money out and we're doing that urgently. But you also need to do the deep work that really interrogates where your wealth came from, interrogates your systems, and as I said, really starts to rebalance some of the power. Because unless you rebalance the power, then actually nothing's going to really change. So the 3-year grant program finishes, and then, racial justice is just treated as, a fad and a trend. And I guess the other thing that we've seen a lot is just a kind of misappropriation of terms, intersectionality, movement building, and various other things are now used in common parlance, but it's not really understood. It's weaponized against people of color, and also there's just lots of people who are not from racially minoritized communities that are using those phrases and are quite skilled at being able to monetize it. So again, we end up in the same circle and cycle where funders are looking in the mirror and seeing or funding people that look like themselves. And that rebalancing of power and resources, we're not really seeing that at this particular point.
And within that balancing act that grassroots organisations are having to do you think it's possible for them to move into the mainstream charity sector and still stay aligned to their values?
I can't see it in terms of so moving into the mainstream. I haven't seen anyone move into the mainstream unless they've been able to do it on their own terms. And a lot of that has been sort of movement building, campaigning and things like that, which has had a real huge, different cycles and different people that's enabled it to happen. It can happen. I'm not saying that you can't have levels of change, but you're kind of looking at quite compromised levels of change in terms of how that would happen. And you've got a real issue in terms of, the charity and charity commission and not being political. It's often the case that, organizations end up being hammered for being too political. And everything is politics. You go to a foundation and you look at the composition of the board and their politics. Who decides who's worthy of the money or not? That's political, right? So you can't turn around and hammer an organization for being too political and they don't get money when actually the way that these organizations are governed are still very, very political. So it can happen, but I think what we're seeing a lot more of when I speak to movements, collectives, is that they want to constitute their work in a way that is non-charitable. We're seeing an increase of organizations that want to have fiscal hosts that will manage the money so they don't need to fall into structures that really restricts their voice.
And what are some ways that you see grant makers being able to support these organizations to flourish on their own terms? What does that look like practically to you?
Trust and space. Trust and space. But again, who's doing the trusting? Because ultimately, when I think about my experiences working in grant making, the best grants that I had were ones where you had someone with a deep vision, a deep understanding of the communities that they were either a part of or that they were working in. And they had a vision of what that change would look like and an idea of what the partnerships were. But it wasn't necessarily fully formed. But that's what you're there as a grant maker to do, right? Is to enable people to have the space, the time, the resource, the freedom to be able to work some of that stuff out. And for me, that is absolutely crucial because there's not enough money in philanthropy as it stands to address the problem. It's not going to, if there was more wealth that was released in terms of endowments and the wealth of those given the money, then we're talking about what philanthropy could be in the truest sense of its term and the original term of being a love of humanity. But at this particular point, if we're still dealing with 2%, 1%, 3%, 4%, you've got to be doing innovation, you've got to be doing movement building, you've got to be doing campaigning, you've got to be doing stuff that has a tangible difference as opposed to things that's really just putting a bit of polyfiller in a crack in the wall.
And so you spoke a bit to what you see the purpose of philanthropy kind of should be. Where does reparations come into that within philanthropy?
So for me, reparations is that's what philanthropy should be doing. So when you think about how wealth has been accumulated in our world, in our capitalist world, but just think about the foundations and our foundations that have direct links to slavery. And these are social purpose organizations with independent money to be able to give in a way that is not restricted by regulation or other things. It's not the education system, it's not this and that. So they actually have the power to give away the money. I don't know whether there is a better starting point or place to start talking and giving back in terms of reparations than philanthropy as it stands. Now, again, when I think about reparations, I'm not just talking about the 2 or 3%, I'm looking at more. But if you're talking about a starting point, then a starting point for me is how do you start giving back some of that wealth? We've already seen foundations, to their credit, do something that the British government and the monarchy hasn't done, which is apologize. So they've done the apology thing. Now start to do the bit around repaying, repairing, healing, but also reparations in terms of community wealth building and putting that money right back into community. So I think, you know, I always go back to, I don't know if any of you guys have read Dark Money, Jane Meyer, where she talks about the America and post-war America and how a lot of the right-wing billionaires ended up funding loads of things to really move how politics are done. And one of the things that she identified, and don't quote me word for word for this, but essentially she said a lot of those billionaires, the Koch brothers and others, put money into deregulations, tax breaks, minimizing government interference, and also minimizing social services. You know, 4 things, probably maybe 4 or 5 things, but there was like 4 or 5 things that enabled them to continue to accumulate wealth, continue to accumulate power, and do that without levels of accountability. And I think one of the problems that we have in our sector is that we actually, I don't know, if you went to a foundation and asked, what's your goal? What's your mission? What do you want to achieve? There's not going to be anything that is going to be really clear where you would say, that's what we're going to fight for. That's one of the clear things we're going to fight for. So for me, one of the things that is a real call from the book is to really say, okay, look, reparations is one thing that we absolutely should be fighting for and using philanthropic wealth to do that with, as well as, you know, taxing the rich, like wealth tax and things like that. I think are 2 things that, in terms of putting our money into it, but also our politics into it, are 2 really key things that we can do collectively in order to move things and shift the dial significantly.
So many more questions from what you just said. Do you feel like, with the way philanthropy is going, does it still have a place within our society? How do you see that manifesting in future years?
I could see what I would love, what I would love for it to be is, so I always say that I would love, like philanthropy in and of itself, it gets a bad rap, right? And it gets a bad rap because the way that we view it is the rich giving to the poor. That's the conception of it. And let's go back to the original meaning of the term. It's love of humanity, right? Let's go back to what communities across the globe have done historically for years and years and years, which is do acts of philanthropy that are absolutely regenerative and absolutely based on solidarity, economics, sacrifice, communities being in the lead. So I'm looking at Patricia here because I know that Patricia, with the Give Black report, very much highlighted partner systems, right? And partner systems, which is, you know, collective ways of giving that the West Indian community did. Well, we're doing it for years and years, but when they came over to this country. But that collectivism and that way of working where risk and reward is shared is a kind of cultural practice of philanthropy that we should be revisiting. That's where we should be going to, where we move away from these real top-down structures, where we move away from grant making as a job, but where we look at, if philanthropy is there to exist in any way, shape, or form, it has to be in a way where those risks and those rewards are shared. And I think, as I said, you've got the partner system, you've got many other practices from Black, Brown, Indigenous communities across the globe that offer really good ideas and models of what that can look like. So, as someone said to me on the panel, in a just world, philanthropy wouldn't exist. But if it is to exist, then absolutely the way that risk and reward are shared, for me, are really fundamental to how it evolves and maybe evolves into a way that leads to its extinction.
Are you seeing more charitable foundations in the UK adopting spend-down models, like in the US?
I'm looking into the audience and hoping if... I haven't seen anyone do it, but it's... I mean, I haven't seen anything. I've seen models where people are looking at spending their returns. So if you look at most charitable trusts and foundations, they've probably earned quite a significant amount of money through austerity, through cost of living crisis, through COVID, through everything, you know. And sorry, I'm only using cost of living crisis as a shorthand. You know, for many communities, cost of living crisis has been an eternal long-term thing. So I just want to qualify before I kind of say that. But through all of the things where a moral panic or a major crisis has happened, most of those foundations have earned quite significant amounts of money. So I am seeing some foundations that are saying, okay, how much is enough? And do we really need to have, I don't know, £1 billion endowment or whatever, you know, and give away whatever amounts of millions from it? Can we start spending some of those returns? Because I'm sure that if you look into it, there's probably some organizations that have made more money in the last 5 years than they've given away. And we still don't know how much of the money that they have accumulated or how they're investing it, how much damage has been done as a result of any of that. So we are seeing it, but again, I come back to this. There is a genuine lack of ambition to really do anything that is what I would deem radical. I wouldn't say radical, I'd call it ethical, but I haven't seen anything much where I would say, yeah, that is a real long-term substantial commitment to communities.
Yeah. I want to switch the focus a bit to talk about whiteness and its impacts within the charity sector. In your book, you reflect on Frantz Fanon's book, talking about black skin, white masks. And I was wondering if you could share a bit about your experience of racism and the white gaze within the charity sector and its impacts as a whole.
I mean, oh God, where do I start? I mean, one of the things that I learned from Fanon's book is just the fact that when you come into England as a black person, you are, I think he uses the word abnormal, because the way that you are viewed, because you're molded by stereotypes. So I always look at it as you are sentenced before you go to birth. And the reason I say that, and I said it at a conference yesterday, because I saw on the news where 2 black boys were accosted for not having a bus pass by either train staff or the police. You know, one of them, a 12-year-old, had hand put around his neck and all of that sort of stuff. And that was down the road from where I live. And it's a shocking incident, and it's always shocking when it's close to home. But what occurred to me is, other than the shock of seeing that happen, but also knowing that that's happening all of the time, and if it wasn't filmed, then it wouldn't get out, was the fact that when I was having the talk with my son, I have a 12-year-old son, so we have the talk. And for all of the moral panics that we see, sorry, it's not moral panics, but it is live panics in terms of serious youth violence and other things. The first talk that I gave to him was a warning about the police. And for me, that's where my heart was really heavy. Like when I was going on the train going to the conference, was the fact that for me, the first thing that when he goes out on his own, I am warning him about the police. So someone that's there to protect us, I am worried about how the police. So if you extend that to our livelihoods, for anyone that is molded by stereotypes, that is sentenced before they are born, you're always in this, as someone describes it, a double bind when you go into the workplace, where you are told, as I was as a kid, you need to work twice as hard as your white counterpart to succeed. Other communities or other friends of mine have said, oh, I was told 10 times, I was told 20 times. And I was like, whatever the statistic is, you have to work harder. So that's one thing that you're struggling with, because you are going home, you are rereading your emails to make sure that you're not being passive aggressive and it's this and that. But the other side of it is where you also know that you're going to face a glass ceiling, where people have boxed you in a particular way which says, this is how far we think you can go in this organization. So you're working twice as hard for twice as less. And then you are sort of sitting there where a lot of your work has been either ignored or erased. So you'll bring up things around racial justice. And again, I will bring up the Runnymede Trust did a brilliant report a few years ago about austerity and what that would mean for women of color. And that was a report about the cost of living crisis for people of color, which was completely ignored and has only been picked up upon by funders over the last year since it's become, so it's ignored. So think about all of the fabulous people that are in these institutions that are bringing this up, that ultimately are ignored or erased. And then suddenly George Floyd's happens, and suddenly they're the voice of black people, and the things they were saying in 2018 that's been ignored, suddenly. That gaze is really exhausting. It is a journey that I think for people working in it is really, really tough and hard. And I don't think it's improved. That's the sad thing for me. I think there's more of us in it. There's less of us in philanthropy. There's less of us that stay in for any length of time, because once you're in and you're doing that, and there is that hope as well, an expectation that when you're in philanthropy, things will be different. It will be slightly different from the private sector, or it'll be slightly different from banking or whatever. But then when you realize that actually it's a kind of extension of that, I think it ends up being really tough. So for me, it was tough, and I made some mistakes while I was in it. I did some good things, and I just hit a tipping point, which was, am I still being effective in this role? Am I still being able to influence enough to take the level of hits, criticisms, or whatever, or being able to ignore certain things in order to get other things through? Where did I just hit my tipping point, and for me, it was the time to kind of leave. But I think that reality is something that is faced by so many people that I speak to in philanthropy, but also charities as well, particularly large charities.
And with the intersection of that, of the philanthropy and the charity, how do you see those racial power dynamics playing out between funders and grantees?
It's all about power. And again, when you were talking about George Floyd and how much has or hasn't changed, that's probably the biggest thing, is that unless you start to see a rebalancing of power, nothing is really going to change in a sustainable way. But then the other anxiety is, how is power handed over? Because if it is done through a very colonial lens, then it means that we end up with a charity sector that looks like having black and brown people that look like our conservative Tory government party and stuff, and that's not going to benefit people of color, So there is also a way of how you transition that, and how you do that patiently, and how you do that. And as I said, the dual strategy of doing that with patience, doing that with, the level of sustainability, while also getting money out. Because you can't sit there and responsibly say, okay, I've worked it out, it's 2033, now I'm gonna make some action. You need to do the actions first, not worry so much about perfection, because it's not gonna be perfect. Have open and honest conversations. And I think more than anything, and this is where I think everyone needs to start with this, is that you have to believe other people's truths. And if that means at times you have to challenge or invalidate your own truths, then that's the starting point. If you can't do that, then you have to kind of question why you're in that particular role. Because the world that we're dealing with is so much, it's larger than the amount of money that we have to alleviate these issues. So you have to listen, but you have to be able to believe other people's truths. And as I said, if you're not challenging your own, then you have to question why you're in that particular role.
And you mentioned a tipping point for you when you decided essentially to leave kind of the mainstream sector. And within you at that time, I witnessed a shift within you, within how you were experiencing the world, and kind of, it was like there was a shedding process going on with you. Can you talk kind of more to what that experience was like of leaving those institutions and what that impact was like for you?
Oh man, God, I don't even know how to answer it. So one, I'm still shedding, and I am still coming to terms with what that was, and I don't fully understand it. I'm still questioning so much about being in that world. One thing I can completely own levels of being in that world and being complicit, right? That's the one thing that, and that's the one thing that I could see very clearly being in it, that there's so much of it that is wrong, but there is so much that you can do within it. And if we're not in it, then the ability to shift the dial while you're there is, we will probably see lots more people that will come into the philanthropic space in years to come, who will go into it, see how bad some of the processes are, and will try to fight it. And some of it might work, some of it might put some of this back. One of the things that you understand about social change is that you need some people that are on the inside opening the doors, as well as those that are campaigning on the outside. It's not just one strategy. So I completely understood that if I'm inside, there's going to be compromises, and it's not going to be this warm and fuzzy, cozy world, and that I'm complicit. I think what really irritates me, and this is probably why I don't really on my biographies put any of the places that I've worked in previously, and that's not to do with the institutions, it's more to the fact that there was never any organization in my mind that enabled me to get to more than 50, 60, or 70% of me. The tipping point of when I often left organizations is when I would go to them and say, I would like to do this. Will you enable me to do this? I've done my bit for you for 2-3 years. I've proven myself. I would like to do this. And it was always the case of no. It was always the case of, if I could put it in a term, it would be, Derek, we want evolution, not revolution. That would be the thing. And again, I'm not saying, oh yeah, everything I was doing was right. But I would go into organizations and I would prove myself and do the work well. But I would also turn around and challenge back and say, now that I've done it, can I have some freedom to be able to do something more? And when that doesn't happen, that is the bit where I'm like, okay, I did some decent things in there, but there was so many compromises and so many layers that I can't put it down as something where the whole of me was into all of that.
Yeah. I often think that working within this sector is kind of like being in an abusive, toxic relationship. You feel like it's going really badly, and then suddenly there's like this carrot, and you're like, oh, okay, it's all worth it, I'll stay. And then it gets really bad again. And you and me often talk about, what does it mean, as you spoke to, working on the inside versus being like, you know what, I'm going to leave this system and just do work on the outside. And that kind of chicken and egg push and pull mentality. How do you know when it's time to leave?
God, that's a tough one. As I said, when I was inside, I hit that tipping point. So once I hit that tipping point, I really understood for me the level of effectiveness that I was having in terms of being able to influence and change was slightly, I won't say it was diminishing, but I could see the writing on the wall. On the outside right now, I think just being able to advocate and do things in a slightly different way, where my voice might have been mute for years and years because I was in institutions that wouldn't necessarily want me to talk about these things or to really say it. I kind of enjoy doing that because it actually gets people to move, and I try to do things with kindness. So it's not like I'm saying this, these different things and I don't have kindness or solutions in my head. But I do think that, there's also a generational thing for me that I'm also considering, which is like I'm kind of old. And at this point, I'm also just thinking about, okay, what is my place in all of this? And is there a place for me in all of this going forward? So we were talking about what we want to do next year and stuff. And so I'm like, yeah, I want to have a bit more joy. I want to have a bit more, fun and start to, center that a bit more than all of this stuff. Because I've done God knows how many talks in the last few months. And it's tough doing loads of talks where you're talking about reparations, where you're talking about racism, where you're talking about this. And, ultimately in your soul, you're like, I kind of just want to dance, you know, I kind of want to go to you know, it was funny. I was watching, I think it was the football recently, and I think Roy Keane said something about how annoyed he was about the Brazilian team dancing every time that they scored a goal or something like that. And I was like, that's part of us. That's part of what, you know, when I think about social change and you think about Claudia Jones creating the Notting Hill Carnival and joy as this form of resistance, and the fact that probably philanthropists wouldn't necessarily recognize that, but here is this wonderful thing that's been around for years and years and years that is a part of us that's not necessarily recognized, but it's just a real important part of what should be injected into our world and our society. I think the fact that you compromise so much when you come into this space of philanthropy where that's not present, where that joy isn't present, I think for me is where I sort of need to just step slightly a bit far away, because it's difficult to just sort of be in that space all of the time, talking about this and not talking about the joyful elements of it.
Let's keep talking about the joy. I know that we've spoken a lot in the past about what does it look like, an ideal situation for a philanthropist or kind of a grant giver to be centering that. What's examples or kind of things that come to mind for you that you just wish that funders would hold in mind and give a grant to allow an organization to do something around joy? What comes to mind?
So I come back to the wonderful Yvonne Field from Ubele Initiative, and she once said to me, because she was part of the anti-apartheid movement many years ago, and she said some of the key principles of the people that she was around was 1, sacrifice, 2, communities being in the lead, 3, joy, 4, laughter, and 5, belief, because everyone that was involved in it, they thought they would win. They all thought they would win. And so for me, and again, this goes back to the book, part of this is, what does philanthropy look like when we start to embed these principles in the way that we start to give? And this is not just philanthropists, this is not just high net worth individuals, it is us as people, it's how we contribute to the world, because ultimately the economic disparities are not getting any better. You know, the amount of money that the wealthy are giving is not getting any better. The world that we live in, where there is plenty of money if wealthy people were taxed more to be able to make sure that low socioeconomic communities are not bearing the brunt of the current situation. You know, there are things that can happen, but for me, if philanthropy starts to embody some of these principles, then it starts to hire differently, it starts to govern differently, but it also starts to really then question its own existence and whether it needs to exist. And so I think for me, we've seen bits of that from the likes of Resourcing Racial Justice and how they've done some of their work. I think we'll see it from Project Talawa and some of the fund that, for global majority women by global majority women, which is really embodying a different type of practice around philanthropy, the Black Feminist Fund. There are pockets of really fantastic work, Baobab Foundation. There are fantastic pockets of people that are doing things differently. I think for me, resource them, give them money to be able to do their thing, free up the money, move the money, but I think also learn from how they are doing some of this stuff, because I think those principles could really inject something different into what we call philanthropy today.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a final question before we kind of open this up and turn this more into a discussion and more questions from everyone. So in the bio for this talk, we use the quote by Samora Machel, which is, "Solidarity is not an act of charity, but the mutual aid between forces fighting for the same objective." Expound on that for me. What does that mean to you?
I think if we called philanthropy solidarity, we would very much view things through a very, very different lens. If you're in, you know, try it. Anyone that's got power, money, or any access to money, maybe when you're in your next board meeting, don't use the word philanthropy, don't use the word grant making, maybe use solidarity making. Just use the term and see what the hell that means for you in terms of your role and the power that you have. there was a great quote by Edward Galeano, a Uruguayan writer, where he says, and I'm not going to quote this word for word, but he sort of said, I prefer the word solidarity to charity, because charity is very vertical and solidarity is horizontal. Right, and when you are learning across in that way, that is a really beneficial thing. So I think along similar lines around philanthropy, that it's more horizontal, but if you start to view your work through the lens of how you are acting in solidarity, in community with those that you're working with, I just think that, to me, that's everything. That is the job, that is the role. So when I talk about really moving away from what we consider philanthropy as an institution and moving it to more of a cultural practice, it is really around solidarity, really being the heart and soul of what that would look like.
Derek, thank you so much. I want to open this up for questions. If someone just raises your hand, and then I can pass you my mic, or, you want... Okay.
I can also project.
Yeah, that's good too.
I wanted to kind of step away from any technical aspects of things and just kind of ask you, you said you reached your tipping point. And I just wanted to, I've had my own experiences as a Black man in this field, and I'm curious about, spill the tea, what was it? What was the thing that got you to the point where it's like, this is not working anymore, this is not what I want to do? Is it a particular idea that you had? Was it a specific interaction? Because I know microaggressions and all these things are things that you cope with and you learn how to navigate. But then there's some times when you're just like, I can't do this anymore. And I'm curious what that was for you and why. And in reflection, have you shed that yet?
Great question, thank you. So much of it is so subtle that I just didn't know in the moment what that was. So I would say that it had been going on for a lot longer than when I reached, the tipping point was there earlier than when I recognized where the tipping point was. So I just want to sort of say that first. There was a particular incident where it was, let's just say it was made known to me with a particular job or role that, someone got the tap on the shoulder that they were going to get the job, and I wasn't tapped on the shoulder. And knowing how my portfolio had performed, it wasn't the case that I wanted the job. It was more the case that I saw how they had boxed me and how they had limited who and what I could be. From the time that they had done that, my head started to move towards, okay, it's time to roll and move out. So that was the tipping point. That was the point where I sort of realized their ambitions for me is not my ambitions within this particular organization. But I would say the more subtle tipping point things, the kind of edgy, was happening sort of long before that. And I probably knew that long before that incident happened. It just took that incident to make me do it. And in terms of, have I no, I haven't shed it, because I think when I was younger, my attitude was, I know this is happening, I'm just going to work through it. I'm just going to work through it. I'm just going to work through it. With the last incident for me, by that point, I was in my mid-40s. So I was like, nah, I'm too old to be doing this. I'm not going to stay and do it. After a time, I just lost patience to be spending time. And I never want to be that person that leaves an organization in bitterness, because I've been angry, but I've never left it at a point where I've just been like burning bridges or anything like that. And I certainly don't want to leave it with a level of exhaustion where I think I have wasted my time being there. I've never been able to do that. I've never done that. So that part I got, but yeah, it probably happened a bit before then.
I think that's really helpful.
Thank you. Hi. I think we've all had our tipping points, and I completely agree that the tipping points, by the time you leave, you knew you should have left probably about 3 years earlier, and you're generally crawling out. and looking for solace. But I hit my tipping point about 2 months ago. But I wanted to check whether my sense of what caused my tipping point is something that's maybe felt by yourself or other of our friends in the room. Part of my frustration came with the idea of being in organisations where there is potential for grant making or philanthropy to do good. Yeah. And one of my frustrations since George Floyd's murder and the recognition that the Black Lives Matter movement was something that people maybe should notice, in spite of the many years prior to George Floyd's murder that the movement had been happening. But the wave of diversity, inclusion, equity and belonging conversations that happened, and my frustration of being around colleagues who had all of the right language and all of the right words and standing at the front and saying everything, and where I felt I was making a contribution, it was being lost in a sea of senior leadership saying everything right. So every microaggression was smoothed over. Every point that you tried to raise was glossed over with a yes, I hear you. And there came a point where I was like, I cannot anymore. And I'm seeing some nods from friends across the room. That was my tipping point. And I think that that's the biggest frustration, being a woman of colour seeking to use my talent to help our communities thrive, is now being in institutions where before the structural racism and the barriers that you're streaking to influence are very visible. Now they are lost in eloquent, positive language. There was a question in there, but I lost the thread, so sorry.
No, it's a great question because it becomes weaponized against you, right? And I think, you always have to be wary about all of the terms, like we were talking earlier about some of the terms, right? Things like identity politics, woke, multiculturalism, and other things which, when you go back to the roots of the meaning of those words, are positive terms. They're not bad things or, they're positive. But the way they've been weaponized by the press to be something to divide and rule and divide and conquer different communities is really problematic. What we've seen since George Floyd is, and I said this earlier, lots of people using the terms of movement building, using the terms intersectionality, using anti-racist terms in a way that coats over the racism within their organizations. And that subtlety, that the subtleness of people doing that is really, really difficult to deal with. And I think it's even worse for a number of people that I know who were talking about this stuff for years and years and years and years. And then suddenly there is like a light bulb moment. And it's like everyone kind of realizes, oh, we need to do something about it. It takes George Floyd being killed to have a light bulb moment. Think about that. There's something really wrong about it. So I can fully understand that because that reflects the experiences of so many different people that I know that work in the sector. I co-founded Future Foundations UK, which I used to be involved in, which is for people of colour working in grant making. And we created that a couple of years before George Floyd's murder, but the increase of anxiety and stress from people of colour working in those institutions, seeing everything that you have just described and more, just caused high levels of anxiety. So I see that. Sorry, the other thing, to go back to your question, I would also say is that I'm kind of, it might not come across right now, but I'm very positive about the world and I'm positive about life. And I think that tipping point also was the bit that fell over for me. And that just popped into my head that I enjoyed doing the work that I do. And I enjoyed working in grant making. I enjoyed doing that. And I think when I got to a point of being a bit cynical about stuff, where I was waking up and I couldn't see the joy and I was just seeing fog. I wouldn't say I was seeing complete, nothing, but just the fog. I think that was also another sort of tipping point for me. When everything became more of a drag, that was another thing for me.
think one of the things that we've all spoken about is that the number of different racialized people coming into the sector. Perfect. Sorry, guys. And I think there's a piece around actually being able to flood the sector with the appropriate talent to actually be able to put them in these roles. So Derek knows that I talk about it as, you know, making the game, talking about the sector, something that people actually want to be able to work in. But I think the biggest issue and narrative is for those kinds of people is that when you study history for campaigners or anything else, they're always great individuals, but the story ends the same. So there's always an inherent fear of, if I do end up becoming said director, said CEO, and I start talking about radicalized movements, someone's going to chop my head off. And, you know, we can all be empathetic people, but we've also probably got a 12-year-old son to think about, bills to pay, everything else along those lines. So for those individuals who are in a position where they are now already starting to think about bringing other people up into the sector, how do you think they can change that narrative? Because I think you do often get people that get to that stage do want to start talking, but think about what might happen to them. Or you get those that are very, very rare where they manage to get to that position, ultimately are empathetic and are lucky enough to have a personality which is kind of like, actually, I kind of just want to tip the tipping cart. I'm not too bothered what happens to me. And I'm kind of here to just mess things up. But that's a very rare individual. But how do you change the narrative around what we've seen, unfortunately, where people get their heads chopped off to get more people to join the sector?
It's a great question because I think, you know, part of it, so I agree about flooding it, right? Because I don't think you can be in a situation where it's just, and I think this is what philanthropy used to be when I first got into it. There was very few black people in it. There was very few people from working class backgrounds in it. There was no diversity in it whatsoever. And the attitude seemed to be at the time more of a, once I get up the ladder, I kind of pull the ladder up because I'm the one person that is in this room. I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore. I think more people are playing an enabling role when they get into positions of power, and I think they are on, and I think this is really key. No, I can't say this is key. I would say that this is how I tend to do things, is that I am quite open and honest about what this looks like and what this will be. Because what you're trying to do is that if you've climbed that stairwell, you want anyone that is working with you to be able to understand what those stairs look like way quicker than what you did, because then they can put their strategies in place. And it's not for me to put the strategy in place for them. It's actually for me to say, this is the steps and I can help, but you're not me. We are different personalities, we are different perspectives and stuff like that, but I can lay out what some of those what the stairs look like and enable people to learn and build up their own strategies. And then the other thing that I would say is protect, 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 right? I absolutely advocate, and I remember saying this to one of my colleagues at 10 Years Time, you know, and the work we do at 10 Years Time is around repairing harm with you know, and rebalancing power. And I say to, and I've said this to my team members, it's like, this is a place where you can just go for it. You can go for it because we will shield you from, you know, the fallout from a particular report or something that we say, you know, because those spaces are really, really precious. They're really precious because it enables people that when they get into the mainstream, they've already got their own political analysis, they've already got their tactics, they've already got their ways of doing things, and it means that they are then enabled to be able to do things for others. And I used to be a journalist, so I was really lucky that in the 90s, when I was struggling to find work, I was able to freelance with loads of black music magazines like Touch Magazine. I was working at the Voice newspapers. And those spaces were really precious because those were spaces where I didn't have to compromise, where everyone that I was around were people that were aligned to things that I was interested in. But it also means that my politics and the things that for me were really safe in those institutions, but when I went into more mainstream organizations were not so safe. I had a bit of confidence to be able to say those things and to be able to pass that on to other people. Some of it worked, some of it didn't work, but I do think that thing around protection and enabling people to understand what that staircase looks like is really important.
I kind of want to challenge a little bit your optimism. So when we have politicians who can blithely say that labeling Britain as racist is treachery, and that this is the most benign multicultural nation in the world, with a straight face, and get applauded for it. When we are in, and all of us, many of us, will be in very white spaces talking about social, investing and impact investing, and using all of those lovely words that we've heard just now about what can happen, yet looking around the table, they are, again, predominantly white, predominantly still men, and predominantly, maybe one woman and one person of color in this space trying to make decisions. I am not someone who is very optimistic that we will move the power balance in philanthropy to anything that looks equitable. I think it will take too long, and if at all. So most of my effort has been around galvanizing us as a communities to help ourselves, going back to Partner or Susu and all of the other community-based collective support and community wealth building. That's primarily. I think that's where more of our energy should go, rather than trying to heal a sector that they can't even talk about systemic racism. The defensiveness that comes out even when you start talking about that is huge. So I just feel like, I would like to say, I think our energy should be more invested in helping ourselves, sustaining our communities, rather than maybe trying to get shifts in the mainstream.
Yeah, and I agree. I don't look at it as an either or, but I think one of the key sort of principles that I put in the book is around self-determination. And for me, that role of philanthropy that's around community wealth building and giving back is something that facilitates self-determination, but that should not be at the cost of us being able to do for ourselves. And I think one of the things that I saw as a journalist in the 90s is that so many of the spaces that enabled me to, when I couldn't get work, I was able to get jobs as a journalist in different organizations. And that enabled me to get a bit of an income and things of that nature. But they were our spaces. But what happened was a number of those spaces ended up trying to mainstream. And once they mainstreamed, they very quickly were either diluted or they disappeared. And so for me, it's really important that those spaces that are created, I think places like the Runnymede Trust, when you look at the amount of talent that have been nurtured and the ideas and everything, when you look at those spaces, I think those levels of self-determination are absolutely crucial. So I think, I absolutely agree about it. I would only look at the philanthropic bit more in the sense of how do you liberate some of that capital to facilitate some of that. And I think it's worth doing, but never at the expense of communities determining their own destinies.
I've got 2 points. Sorry, am I on now? That's better. 2 points.
Have you got any questions?
Yes.
Okay, great.
They're questions on the basis that I'm a grant maker on a spend out, spending money that's been made over the last 25 years. And I'm just a little worried, Derek, that you are a very accomplished presenter, very smooth operator, throwing out some statistics, or rather lack of statistics, that really justify what's happening. My experience of the grant-making sector is that it is much more informed now and is in a much better place than it was 25 years ago. And my second point is that we've been talking quite a lot about colour rather than philanthropy. And would it not be better if we tried to move away, and you gave us an example of these 2 lads who were picked up for trying to jump the trains. The fact that they were black actually wasn't relevant.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you, actually. Yeah, that's not okay. This event is talking about racism and white supremacy and its functions within philanthropy and the charity sector. If you're not able to take that on board, then maybe this isn't the space for you. I really hope that you're able to, but... I'm happy to chat with you about it after, but you didn't even have any questions.
I was getting to the question that
I would like to ask some other people to add some questions. I'd be happy to chat
Okay,
with you
let
after
me,
as well.
but I do want to respond to this. So, Funders for Race Equality Alliance, 5% of racially minoritized leaders get money in this country against 14% of people in this country. Black feminist organizations get 0.1% of funding. We have a sector where 0.1% of the major charities, 89 charities, account for 1/3 of all of the income that goes into charities. There's 74% of charities that are under £100,000 in terms of how much income they bring in, that account for 2.7%. 0.2% of money goes to environment and gender. I could go on and on and on, because I know that every time that I do these talks, someone asks me to qualify it with a lot of statistics. And I can run off statistics in a second if you want me to run off statistics. I didn't want to do that because it might be a bit dry for people in the audience, but the reality is that that's my truth, right? What I'm talking about today is my truth and my reality. But for people to understand the reality when I do these talks, often because they don't understand my truths, I also have to come with statistics. So I'll happily reel off any statistics you want that will tell you that the disparities that exist in philanthropy are real, and there's still an absence of data in terms of it, but in terms of disability justice, in terms of racial justice, in terms of the amount of money that we get, the fact that FTSE 100 organizations have more diversity than the top 500 charities in terms of percentages, I can reel off a number of statistics and reports that validates everything that I'm saying today. It's also in the book as well.
Hi, thank you. So 2 points. I've got a question and a comment.
Oh, sorry, where are you? Can you put your hand up? Oh, you're there, thank you.
So first of all, thank you for giving me the language to articulate the tipping point and the boxing in. And I didn't have the words for that, but it was quite relatable. And I think many of us have been through that process and have reached a tipping point and moved on without having the language to express that lived experience. Then the second point is, I'm coming from African diaspora development, from mainstream development, and now I'm lecturing. I'm actually a module organizer for fundraising management. And one of the things that stands out for me is, if we're going to liberate the capital, because we do need that capital to be liberated, we need more diverse fundraisers. Because it's the fundraisers that spoke to Bill Gates, to Mackenzie Scott. You know, she gave $6 billion, but somebody spoke to her about giving $6 billion somewhere. So who are the people talking to her? Who are the people speaking to these philanthropists giving money? So I think that's where, for me, and we could actively bridge the gap by making the sector more diverse, so that the people who have that, who are sitting on that capital that needs to be released, can actually release it and focus it where it needs to go. I don't know what your thought is on that. Thank you.
We try. we genuinely try. I mean, at 10 years' time, we try to get to wealthy people.
Can you say maybe a bit about 10 years' time for people who don't know?
So 10 years' time is a philanthropy advice and education organization. So what we do is we take wealthy people, corporate foundations, charitable trusts through learning journeys to enable them to repair harm, rebalance power, but by resourcing racial and economic justice with care and confidence. That's what we do. And so we spend a lot of our time working with a number of people with wealth to help them redirect their funding in a way that is fairer, with greater levels of accountability, and to move money quickly. That's on the very, very first level. On the second level, we start to challenge them in terms of interrogating wealth, where that wealth was accumulated from, and start to get them into a space where they start to look at how they release more of their endowed funds and do things slightly differently. So we're introducing them to different constituents, different ideas of what change looks like, and also trying to ensure that the people that they are funding don't just look like them. So when people come to us, that's what we're trying to do. So I completely agree. But often it is the case that when we get to a client, we might not be the first or second person that they've got to in terms of getting that level or layers of advice and stuff. But it's certainly an important space. We're nurturing more people to be in that space. So it's not just about fundraising. So there's also that bit around philanthropy advice and philanthropy education and trying to get more people in those spaces so they can speak to those around how they invest in a very different way.
Hi, sorry, I've got the mic, so I'm going to ask the next one whether you like it or not. It is a question. Derek, Lily, thank you for the conversation. My question is a bit about education, actually. Picking up the point about whether this should be a discussion about race or philanthropy, in both of those, in my small experience, privilege plays a central role, and being privileged is often like being a bull in a china shop when you think you're a mouse in a sponge shop. How do you educate the bulls that they're a bull and that they're in a china shop?
Some bulls you cannot convert and change. Because their lens to a lot of things might be only crisis that happens within them or something that happens with them to change. So there's lots of clients that we will not work with. There's lots of people that once we've done some of our values work with people, we'll say, actually, we can't work with you. We can absorb quite a bit with different organizations. What I mean is, it's not the case that anyone that's dealing with me in the way that I work is necessarily going to agree. But after we've done some work, we do expect some level of listening and understanding, particularly before we get some of our clients working with different community members, because we don't want that to be a harmful interaction. And some of the time, we just don't get there. Other times people surprise us, because they might not agree with either my politics or my organization's politics, but they are keen to move money. And they're keen to, in their head, they see that something is wrong, and they might get to 20% of our education, but say, you know what, we just want to move money. There are others that go through deeper, more meaningful stuff. But most of the work is very relational. Most of it is around understanding how we talk to people. Is we will challenge and we will be hardcore, but we're going to resolve the issue in terms of how we work with you, and we will absorb some things. There's just some things that we're just not going to absorb to be able to get to that end goal. So yeah, it varies, but I don't think there is an assumption that some of the more liberal people that we will work with are going to be the most progressive, and that is a wrong assumption, right? Because some of the people that have been able to move money very quickly and very differently have been further away from my politics or the work that we do than some of the those that have the language, as you said, or can say or talk a good game, but will not necessarily, do that in terms of their actions.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you. My question is really, hey Derek, hope you're well. I'm a product of the floods. I came via 2027 into the sector after about 15 years in the community, from grassroots to international development level. And so race has always been a barrier for me. I picked up disability along the way. Here comes another barrier. But one of the barriers that I don't hear being talked about a lot is the intergenerational one. I found that in the community, many of the people that I work with in the community took work from me, to people who were about 2 decades older, but less experienced and less progressive than I was. And so I strived for a long time in the community. I was not paid, I was not able to develop myself, to get training. I don't have any higher education, okay? And then I found myself in international development spaces where I was writing policy recommendation to heads of state, where I was working on an international level with my brothers and sisters. And, to be blunt, they betrayed me, okay? And they betrayed themselves because they misappropriated the funds that were in those spaces for their own aims. So after dealing with that, I came back and I felt, where can I use all this life experience? I was glad to find 2027 because it was the first place I'd seen that was championing lived experience. But when I find myself now 3-4 years into being in the sector formally, one of the barriers that we are still dealing with is that intergenerational gap, where older people who I am working with do not understand the context of the world as it is today, do not understand a lot of the dialogue of younger generations when it comes to race, when it comes to disability, when it comes to climate, and all of that type of thing. I'm extremely cynical, do you understand? But I keep striving anyway, because I have been conditioned to do that. And I'm blessed with that conditioning at least. But my question is really, how are we bridging that intergenerational gap in philanthropy? And what can we do to learn from that in community as well? Because I don't see that issue being in one space, but it's one that I think is really neglected.
So you nailed it. It's not just in the philanthropic space, it's also in the community space as well. And I think that the thing that I keep coming back to on a personal level is that thing around, what are you passing on? Have I become too conservative? Is my politics starting to narrow as I get older? Have I stopped letting people through? You know, there's a whole bunch of things that are happening there. So look, on the philanthropic side, we always take the view that we don't do consultancy, we do learning journeys, because it takes a long time, and what you're trying to do is lots of undoing. And when I was talking about the 19th century thinking, I wasn't being flip, because I think if you asked a lot, I would be interested if you did a poll and asked trustees of these foundations, are you proud of empire? What do you believe about race science? You know, is race a social construct? I'd be interested what their responses would be, because that would dictate how they would view us consciously and unconsciously. And I suspect that there is a lot of 19th century thinking which you cannot, you know, it's not like people can do a program with us and it's like, oh, they've suddenly had this aha moment. You're trying to get to a point of unraveling something that enables them to understand that maybe they should either move out of the way, or they should devolve power, or do things differently, okay? I'm an old youth worker, so I've got to admit, part of my positivity comes back from a very youth worker lens and working with young people, and at times seeing what they were going through and feeling positive for the world. Not naive, not trying to hide or change things, but being positive about what and who they could be, because anyone that's been a youth worker would see where lots of young people have been able to excel from positions where they haven't been able to excel. But I think the big thing moving out of philanthropy for us as a community is probably that intergenerational question, and what that looks like in terms of our activism and in terms of how we enable others from our communities to move through. Because what I've also seen post George Floyd is a lot of infighting. I've seen I've been doing a lot of mediation with different community groups and stuff that is going on that means that a lot of the time we are falling over before we even get to the start line. And for me, one of the questions that always pops up is, okay, if we are trying to tackle the enemy, who is the enemy? Because we are treating each other at times as enemies. So that question around what we do within our communities is, I don't have an appropriate answer to that, but it's a big one, because I think that has been exacerbated over the last 2 years. And I think the role that philanthropy has played in terms of the competition bit, in terms of small-time funds, and in terms of, and people in this room would have seen this, you know, it happens to us all of the time. There's a tender bid that will get put out to say we want to do racial justice work within an organization, and you know, we will get called and said, oh, Derek, we want you to put in a bid. And I know that a number of colleagues that I'm in partnership with, right, have also been given that bid. And if we're not talking and saying, okay, we're stepping aside, then suddenly people that we're in community with, we're in competition with, So some of the rules that we have in philanthropy does not facilitate ways in which we as a community can thrive in a particular way.
We've run out of time, but we're going to make time for one last question, because I know that no pressure, if you want. Is there another mic?
Don't think I can project the way other people can in the room. And so my name is Harvey. I'm the head of development at the London Community Foundation. I'm one of few black fundraisers who lead teams, but also drive income and speak to loads and loads of white philanthropists and also corporates, because remember, in the corporate space, it's also a very white space. And I remember the lady just talking about Bill Gates and Melinda Gates and the Bezos. Again, they're all white philanthropists. And I think we need to start turning the conversation and speaking about black philanthropists like Mo Ibrahim, but also Marcus Rashford and Sir Lewis Hamilton. And there are even more and more of these people. So how do we talk about these people, but also the everyday, maybe someone who's made money in business, works in the city, wants to give. There's loads and loads of black philanthropists. How do we amplify their voices, and what can we do about that?
Speak to Patricia. So yeah, I would genuinely say speak to Patricia. But the other thing that I would say about that, there is also an issue around how you penetrate their advisors that sit around them, because irrespective of what their desires are and the color of their skin, if the people that sit around them are still preoccupied with wealth, growth, and accumulation, and as has often been said to us, when they come to us around philanthropy, they want to do good because of what, is good for them, not necessarily for the needs of community. There is still an issue around how you advise that. So Stephanie Brobby, who does a lot of work with the Good Ancestor movement, works with those wealth advisors, and I would say that's a really important step, because how they advise their clients and how they work with their clients, I think is really, really key to ensure that if you are a black person that's come into wealth, that you don't replicate some of the harms that you've seen from other charitable trusts or foundations or other wealthy people, because of that wealth industry firm that's around you is just going to probably act exactly the same as they will with a white client, as they will with a black client. So I think that part, in terms of how that is resurrected and how that's changed, I think is really, really crucial. And again, I say this to speak to Patricia, I think nurturing black philanthropists and the world that they occupy, and how you find ways of working with them very early, so they go through a journey in terms of what their philanthropy, their giving starts to look like, I think is absolutely fundamental and key.
Just had a quick answer, also just wait, because from a commercial standpoint, their clients are now getting more radicalized and commercialized. So 5 years ago, I used to work for the Foundation as well, and 5 years ago, they never ever approached us about donor-advised funds, how to do this, we don't understand. Sorry. So I was just saying, there's also a piece around waiting and taking time, because their clients are now becoming more radicalized. And we're talking about intergenerational, but I'm a bit more controversial on this, but that generation is going to die. So let me finish. Let me finish. On an important piece, there will be a wealth transfer from that generation down to the lower one. Commercial organizations think about legacy. So there is an understanding that currently where the wealth is held in this piece is going to be transferred to a 24, 25-year-old person that does not think the same way as their parent or grandparent that is passing it on to them. So there is also a piece around just waiting, because sooner or later they'll be knocking your door down as well, just with a bit of optimism. Apologies if anyone saw what I was
So I think waiting, but also building your infrastructure for that, right? So I think the absolute key bit is what happened after George Floyd, when tons of money was flooded over a very short period of time. There wasn't the infrastructure to be able to manage that, direct it really, really well. So I think part of this is also about just being ready for when that wealth transfer, which is $30 trillion over the next 20 years or so, when that happens, being ready to be able to do it, but also being firm in your convictions and your politics around that, because some of that will start to catch up.
Okay. We're about to finish, but I guess a final point I'd like to speak to is directly to the other white folks in the audience like me. And I guess it's always happens really often with white people after events that center whiteness and talking about race and racism and white supremacy. People are leaving wondering what to do next and what their position is within this. And I would just like to say that if you are not part of a white praxis or white accountability circle or triad, please do. White accountability is key within this, and that needs to happen in white spaces as a key part of this work, in processing and one's relationship with causing harm and kind of what that looks like, and one's relationship with whiteness and race and white supremacy. If you are interested in joining those types of groups and not sure how to find them, please link up with me. I'd be happy to kind of share resources and key things about that. So yeah, on that note, Derek, thank you so much. And thank you everyone else for contributing as well. Oh, also, if you want to buy a book and you haven't, Derek will be signing. Are you signing any more?